I'm Andrea Schara, making a videotape today, September the 17th, for the clinical conference on September the 18th at the Georgetown Family Center. And with me today are Mark Eitt and Elizabeth Eitt. I asked them because of my interest in whether or not Bowen theory is good for your family and friends, plus whether or not you might be able to enter into a more professional, clinical/consulting role with family. So this particular couple, Elizabeth Eitt is my first cousin on my father's side of the family, and she's been interested in Bowen theory for many years, and we have had many conversations about it, and she has taken the community course and had a lot of exposure to Dr. Bowen from 1976. And Mark, her husband, has also had a lot of exposure to Bowen theory. And I entered into a professional relationship with Mark as a consultant around 1989, 1990, around the time that his business was having difficulties. And this is about the fourth tape I think I've made with you, Mark.
Right.
And I said at the time that I was going to undergo this consultation with you that it could possibly affect your marriage, it could possibly affect my relationship with your wife. These are two, I thought, highly probable events.
Mm-hmm.
And but if you were up to it and willing, I was up to it and willing, but I didn't think it was going to be as easy as an ordinary consulting relationship where you don't have a previous history of the relationship.
Right.
So in any triangle, you always have two close and one on the outside. And it had always been that I was closer to my cousin Elizabeth and you were slightly on the outside. And then for me to enter into more of a consulting role with you, it was, I thought, would shift things where I would be spending more time talking with you about things and Elizabeth would be on the outside. And then there might be some tension related to the management of that, which could end up in your marriage or who knows where. So I think everybody, Elizabeth was also aware of this and willing to pay the price. And I think eventually it probably worked out reasonably well. But I thought today that one of the reasons that I also wanted to have you in here is that not only have both of you spent a lot of time thinking about Bowen theory and using the ideas to regulate your marriage, but I thought I've had Mark on the tape many times and I haven't had Elizabeth on the tape, and I call you Liz really, but what would it be like to put your marriage on the tape and me be on the outside, put you two back together again? So that was kind of my thinking about it. Is Bowen theory useful to your family and friends? Certainly in the normal psychiatric training, you learn that you should not have any professional relationship with your family or friends. And I think Bowen theory is different in this way, that if the person is willing to really manage themselves, it can be done. But it's not for everybody. It's not for the weak of heart. Whether I've made a bigger mess of things or been more useful, I don't know. Maybe only time will tell. But you're still married. Liz comes from a family that had divorce in it, was raised by a single-parent mother, which should have, according to the literature, increased the chance that she would have a divorce or have more problems in her marriage. So you, Mark, were raised in a family that did not have a divorce and was a traditional family with the father working and the mother
Right.
staying at home raising the children.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought maybe you could also represent two different versions of the extended marriage and the extended family. And I don't really care what you all want to talk about in terms of your ideas about Bowen theory or marriage, and I usually start with the female, with Liz, and I'll try and remember the time so that I can give half the time to Liz and half the time to you, Mark. And if you all want to interrupt, throw wrenches at me or trick me in any way, I won't be surprised. Go ahead.
Well, I think in the comment about being raised by a single mother,
Yes.
I was raised by a single mother, although the situation was not just my mother and myself. I was raised in a fairly large extended family, although my father was not at all present. They were divorced before I was born. So my experience of being raised by a single mother really was more complicated because she was in many ways, I think, still a child in the home as I was a child in the home. So there was grandmother, grandfather, 2 uncles when I was first brought home from the hospital, an aunt that lived 5 minutes away, and then another uncle that was present, very present and accounted for, although he lived in Williamsburg with his growing family and growing business. So there were a lot of cousins and a lot of grown-ups, and I think that I was raised really in kind of a atmosphere of benign neglect. I was never told that I couldn't be in on grown-up conversations, or it was just a great big mishmash in a big Irish Catholic family all the time, lots of discussion and dinners and problems and births and deaths and all that sort of thing. And really I wasn't isolated from any of those life experiences, nor do I think were really any of the other cousins, except for those who were the product of other relationships that were more cut off in their own parental system.
So you you basically had a lot of relationships, a lot of access to people, yet you weren't really a child of a mother-father. You weren't able to look at your parents and try and figure out what a marriage was all about. You had to look at your grandparents' marriage to try and figure out what a marriage was all about.
Or my uncles.
Or
my
your
one uncle.
Your one uncle who lived in Williamsburg.
And then also my
you
aunt.
spent summers with.
Yeah, and my aunt also had a marriage that I was looked at certainly from the time I was born until I was 6 when she died.
So
but I was very involved in that family every day. We would go over there.
And did you actually think about this, how a husband and wife in a marriage works in your thinking before you, or as you were thinking about getting married yourself, and what the experiences would have been when you were dating guys, not having a father around? How did that have any effect on you? I'm
sure it had an effect on me because my mother never dated. So that I knew of. I mean, she probably, there's hearsay that she had affairs when I would go to my uncles and my grandparents who lived in Williamsburg during the summer, that she had a couple of flings, but I never saw her in relationship to really any men except family members. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure that it had quite a large impact. And getting married to me was more of thinking about the tape this morning, the sound guys were saying the difference between a romantic marriage and a practical marriage is about a year. Well, I think that there was some romance, and romance is all fine, well, and good, but I had some practical reasons for wanting to get married, which was, first of all, to get out of this house because people were sort of dropping like flies around me as in death. So I had this push, this urge, I think, unconsciously, perhaps unbeknownst to me, that I did want to get out and make a life for myself and perhaps rebuild something that maybe I never had, maybe I had a little bit of it, but I definitely wanted to start my own business, so to speak.
So the idea of being in a single parent family, in a way, for you was slightly different because your mother was almost like another sibling, an older sibling in a way, and your grandparents would have been more like the parents.
The parents, yes, and they treated her as though she were still, as a child, even
Right.
though she made her own living and brought money into the household and that sort of thing. The emotional climate was really very much that she was the daughter and they were the parents.
Right, and so part of that would have been then the way that your mother was controlled or treated as perhaps older sibling / mother would have given you more impetus to get out and rebuild a family. Did you have a model in your head of what a family would look like? What your business would look like, to use your metaphor? And how much of that model would have been based on thinking and how much would have been based on this automatic process of reacting to being raised in this single parent blended type family?
Yeah, it's more difficult to answer the first part. I think the automatic was, really, I had a big push, an urge to start, to get out of that and into something else, because it was pretty intense. A lot of drinking, a lot of depression, a lot of death. Ick.
and so your head went in the direction of,
I can perhaps get out and start something for myself
yes,
that will be have more of an elevated emotional climate. I'm interested in getting married, I'm interested in raising children, and I want someone to help me do this project who is a stable person who likes me.
Well,
and
that seems reasonable.
Yeah, and
Now,
whom I like.
Now, so that would be a reasonable set of expectations and ideas that perhaps many people would have, and perhaps many people who come from single parent families. Did it concern you at all that you didn't know your dad, or that he hadn't been around? Was that a thought even in your head?
Not particularly about the marriage until my first child was born.
Okay.
And then you met Dr. Bowen. And that, so really very early in our marriage, the concept of who is this man who is my father, that became really a big part of my life. In my thinking, a little later on, I cogitated about who is this man who is my father. I've never met him. I know I have a family because my mother told me that, obviously I have a father and he has a family, and she told me what little she knew, but it was very little. Maybe 10 times she would mention it in maybe 2 or 3 sentences, some very, very sparse information.
What year was your daughter born, Delia?
She was born in 73, the end of the year.
1973.
Yeah.
And so at that time you started thinking more because the grandfather was somehow important, or what do you think sparked that?
Well, my interest in my father is what you're asking? Well,
Right.
I had just had this baby,
Yes.
and so now my husband is a father.
Right.
So that's one part.
Okay.
And the suggestion that this could possibly be a possibility to find this guy.
Right. Okay.
And so I had another child 4 years later, and in my mind I was thinking who is, just cogitating a little bit more than I ever had in my life on who this person is. And then began in earnest the search for him when that second child was about 6 months old, between 3, when she was first born.
Okay. And
which is when my mother died.
Right. And your mother had died when your second child was how old? 3?
Oh, she was maybe 2.5 months. She
2.5
was born
months.
in February. My
Okay.
mother died in April.
So maybe I would speculate that with the death of your mother, you were a little freer to look into your father.
Well, actually, we had one correspondence when my mother was still alive.
Okay.
So
How
that
did
was when that first daughter was maybe, right before I got pregnant with the second kid.
Would your mother have been ill? Would that have influenced?
Well, she was a fairly serious alcoholic by that time, and my uncle, who lived in the house, who I lived in the house with him, I mean, people died in a fairly close succession from the time I was 17 until the last one died, my mother, in 1978. So, there's always kind of a death. There's a nodal point of a death of these important people to my life, these adults, that go with my marriage. My grandmother died, I got married, and Leo died, and I wrote the letter to my father. My mother died, and
Okay, so rebuilding, reconnecting. I remember Dr. Bowen saying that in a good family, when somebody dies, someone replaces that person.
Right.
And so if you thought about a viable root system that you have, you could say some of the roots get old, wither away. Some of them die before their time, but new roots are formed, and the plant can still sustain itself because the root system is still viable. And exactly whether or not this is an emotional process which is so deep related to plants, the need to maintain the connection with the family, or whether this is a psychologically available mechanism that you psychologically just say, well, I'd like to know my dad, and I'm aware that I don't know him. I don't know who can say what is the real force behind the wish or the need or whatever the mechanism is to connect with your family. But for you, when you look at it, it was more a willful thing, that you decided that you were going to do this. The automatic forces would have had to do with the deaths.
I would say that the push was in my gut.
Okay.
It was a real physiological, I don't really have a word to describe what the
Sounds primitive, though.
I mean, really,
it's
very.
in your gut. It's primitive.
Right, it's in my gut. It's primitive. It's in there.
Okay.
But then I was also thinking, hey, there's this guy out there. He's my father.
Okay.
Talk about an interesting project.
So it's an integrative function of these two things, a feeling and a thinking component. And how did that all affect your marriage then?
Well, we had these little babies too. Now, really, the effect on the marriage when I decided to go and see my father, to actually make that, which I blindsided my father on that because he did not want a relationship with me. His family did, sort of. One of my aunts really did, and but he did not. And so, Mark was just very supportive, and would talk to me about it, and I would talk to him about it, and there's this analysis that goes on with making a relationship with somebody who's as significant as a father whom you've never met. But Mark's mother was not happy about this. She did not think that this was a good idea for, certainly, me, because of course, he didn't want me, and I could be rejected face to face, and then what would that do to her son and the children? Oh my God, you know, the children.
So she became the transducer of anxiety. She absorbed
She would say.
the worry,
Mhm,
and
she
she
would-
started to process that worry and then feed it back into the marriage in her way. And then so then you had to deal more with your mother-in-law than you did with your husband
Right.
in order to keep your marriage stable.
And if I knew a little bit more then what I knew now, I would say thank you so much, Mrs. Eitt.
for absorbing all this anxiety
Sure.
and processing it in your
Sure.
own way.
Sure.
So your mother dies, you're able to go ahead and make that contact, your husband supports you, you don't get shot or rejected, you actually get to know the people in your family, you have a greater root system there, and then in addition to that, you and I are taking trips during this time to have more contact with the past generations and the great aunts in Illyria. And I always remember that as not the fear of death promoting it, but the fear of aging. And going to...
With death just around the corner in that other room.
Yes, exactly. And that making contact with these people does raise a lot of primitive fears. And then coming back from these trips, again, you would have to go through more of a reintegration with your husband, I think. I don't know if there are other ideas that you had about building a root system with the extended family into the third or fourth generation. You have any thoughts about that?
Well, once I got the idea that this was a way to operate in a family, it became exciting, very interesting to do. Whereas just a single nuclear family just basically was not very much. In a way, it's sort of boring when you don't. When I thought about just that, I was really very interested in finding out about these people, and I love stories, and I love to tell stories, and everybody's got such a great story, and when you're related to them, but you've never met them, then it really is a very exciting thing, which gave Mark and I a lot to talk about, and gave me a lot of good stories to tell my kids.
Right.
So, you know, that was...
So that was the advantage to it.
That's the advantage.
The disadvantage...
The disadvantage is, you know, I was crabby when I would come home. And there's a lot of reentry that gets, that gets going. And, I had been gone, and I had all this stuff to process, and had these little kids to take care of, and, a dish might be out of the sink, or, the dog might have done a little something or another. But, there's just this generalized anxiety that I would bring home, and it would get settled in somewhere in there. And then, though, I think that I have gotten better through this practice. It's really practice. It's like learning how to skate, or learning how to, drive a car or whatever. Learning how to go out, somehow or another figure out who I am with these people, come back home, and then figure out who that little bit of a new person is in this smaller unit, which is my husband and my children and my home and my animals and that sort of thing. But there's a change, a little bit of a shift or a change. Not much, not a lot, and sometimes not even recognizable really until way down the line, a little bit after.
So would you say that this change, what kind of a change is it? Is it you bring up the things in the beginning about, you've got all the high risk markers for you, for your marriage, for your children, alcoholism and this and that, and and I'm always thinking about this. You're changing your emotional functioning in the way in which you have a relationship with people in your extended family, which then plays out in your marriage with your mother-in-law, with your children, and so forth and so on. How would you think about that? What are you really regulating? Are you regulating genes? Are you regulating your neurochemistry? Or are you just only regulating your mindset? Or all? I don't know.
I would say that my biggest lesson in regulating, maybe all of those things, maybe some of those things, I don't really know, I can't speak to exactly what is regulated, were my back attacks.
Okay.
So my first back attack, and these have been two fairly serious, paralyzing situations, physical situations where I was down and in a lot of pain, and for a while.
Yeah.
And the first one was 6 years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
And I decided not to have the operation,
Mm-hmm.
and listened to biofeedback tapes for 5 hours a day in the beginning, like the first week, 2 weeks,
Mm-hmm.
and gradually listened to them less and less every day. But that entrainment, I think, is really the best word that I can use,
Mm-hmm.
to calm myself down in a really anxious situation. I couldn't walk, I could barely talk, I have to have people like getting me stuff. Ew.
A little dependency.
You know, little dependency, which, you know, I mean, that's a kind of another level of the back attack, I think. But this back problem runs in my family. That, I think, and then the most recent one was a year ago, gave me a way to really think about what anxiety is, how it really, really gets me, because, I mean, talk about a primitive level. The physiology was just in my face.
Exactly.
And I changed it. I changed the way I thought about what was going on in my body with this serious pain, and I watched my family watch me do it. And none of them really helped me out a whole lot. It was a group effort.
So you're saying that the back attack, the anxiety that generated that may have been generated by shifting the relationships in the extended family and the shifting of relationship, trying to deal with anxiety. If I would put one fact in, I think that was around the time in '92 that with your husband's business having all the problems that they had.
Right.
So you may have absorbed some anxiety there in that relationship with him. And then you get this physical symptom in which you can see a different level of cooperation, if I'm listening to you, in the way that you're able to manage yourself and the way that your family your nuclear family is able to relate to you.
And my extended family,
And your
too.
extended family
Right.
is able to relate to you. And that would also be true in the most recent one. But that one would have had more to do with not your husband's business as much, or would it still be the anxiety generated in there, or would it be other things?
The second one, I think really both the first back attack and the second back attack occurred at a point where things were less anxious. So there's this period of anxiety, goes up, 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 up. I deal, keep the head above the water, keep their heads above the water, deal. And then it gets sort of settled down, and then boom, I'm
Okay.
down.
Time to take a vacation.
Time to take a little rest. Right. Much better would have been to go to the Bahamas.
Well, they both start with B's, the Bahamas and the
Right,
back.
that's probably- So, although I probably wouldn't have, I know I wouldn't have learned as much on a vacation in the Bahamas.
Okay. Well, maybe I can get back to you about this, but I want to